All right, so welcome to my TED Talk. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the part of design systems you probably won't really see in Figma. Um, I figure we were all anticipating a Figma talk today about the essentials of design systems, what the sort of foundational elements were, and I wanted to go into some more organizational and not really theoretical, but like behind the scenes stuff that people maybe don't poke into as much or think of as sort of secondary, but become really important when you're working with a design system. And then that way you sort of have an edge up when you go to Figma's talk and can finally start putting components on a screen. Um, a little bit about me. My name is Matt. I'm a product designer at Understood, where I'm both that and an accessibility advocate and the design systems guy, where we make learning and support journeys for people and the people around people with learning and thinking differences. I also am helping on the UX House site with the design system there, so that's my third system that I've worked on over the course of around 2 years, which now that I'm saying that out loud is kind of crazy, but there's that. um, Couple quick things I wanted to mention just before I get started. The first is that even though I'm revealing that I work at understood.org, this is a me presentation, not an understood presentation. Unfortunately, I can't really show what I'm working on there. The second thing to know is that I'm recording this for personal use, so just a heads up in case at some point you're thinking of getting on voice. And the last thing I wanted to bring up was if you have questions, if you wouldn't mind popping them in the chat, just because I tend to kind of get on a roll and may not hear it if it's on voice, but I'll leave plenty of time to talk about stuff. Um, cool. So let's talk systems. All right. This is a question that I'm sure you've seen all over Medium. What is a design system? And you'll get a million different answers, and that's because the answers it's a heck of an answer, and the answer is it's a component library. No, I'm kidding. That's that's part of it, but there's a lot more around the component library to make it really a tool that a full team can work on in earnest. Um, and really provide value to an organization. And to me, the most important part of a design system is its values and processes, and how it serves as a tool for what is called design ops, which is sort of like how DevOps deals with the tech stack, how developers actually work with each other and outside departments and deploy. That's design ops, sort of the design equivalent, which is not really dealing with design itself as much as team organization, workflows, and things like that. And values and processes are at the sort of core of design ops, and that's how I think a design system plays out most importantly. And also, of course, the documentation of component library, the values, processes, and all sorts of other tangibles and intangibles about a design system. So, the way that I like to think about a design system, and I know that's sort of like a nebulous definition, I'm getting there, but whereas a lot of the school of thought that refers to a design system as a component library thinks of it as a design tool, but on top of that, it's also a service for other designers and for engineers and the sort of interfaces between them. I think of a design system as design ops, designing how designers design, if you want a tongue twister. And most importantly, it's its own product. It's an internal tool. It's something with users, with uses, with business cases, outcomes, desired interactions, just like whatever you're putting out on the web. So like I've been sort of a broken record about, I think a design system is entirely its values and principles, or the values and principles that it imparts on your tech team. So that seems sort of like an afterthought, because a lot of design systems you see on the web will sort of tuck this away. But in reality, these sort of values and principles are the criteria by which everything you put into the system and everything you put from the system onto your site or app or other product is measured. Everything you do has to live up to those. And while it's not necessarily super flashy, it's super important as sort of cementing your design system as an asset in your organization. And because it's, to play the catch 22, it's how your organization presents itself to the world via digital means. So you want to make sure that everything is up to snuff. Everything in the design system is something that's actually going to help your team out. Everything's reusable, so forth and so on. It's also a way to sort of determine how your alignment with other people goes. If you're an engineer with designers, non-technical individuals, it's supposed to be like a single source of truth, and the values and principles are the single source of truth for your single source of truth because everything should adhere to it. It's a good way to hook into organizational values. So, for example, I don't know, if your company has some sort of visionary statement about putting good out in the world, or say you work for, I don't know, an internet security company, and one of their values is everything we do is secure. We put the person first. Aligning your design system values and principles with that is a good way to cement it as like a really important factor in your organization. And also, it's a good way of justifying why your design system exists. I know a lot of people have trouble uh, getting buy-in for one at their organization, but I think that your values is sort of like a value add to, or your values as a way to display the value of your design system. I know it's like a very jumpy sentence, to your organization as a way of like getting its actual intention out in the world, and also as sort of like a culture setter, is a good way to justify it to people who will ultimately be paying for it. So some examples of good values are inclusivity. I see a lot of design systems talk about accessibility. There's a myriad other ways this can be interpreted too. So performance is one, making sure that whatever you make can perform on lower tech devices or in places where the internet is slow, or if people aren't tech savvy. And equally importantly is being inclusive of your team, making sure that diverse voices are heard, making sure that dissent is measured and things like that. Is also really important, and as a way to express your design system as both an internal and an external tool. Quality is a big one. Kind of goes without saying, make good stuff. The way that I like to put it is to be the change you want to see on the internet. A lot of people talk about consistency here, which is, again, I think sort of table stakes, but should be mentioned anyway. I like using the same metaphor for components and styles that people use for eyebrows, which is sisters and not twins. Um, there are a lot of organizations who use values involving practicality. So IBM Carbon used to have one that I really like, which is that solutions should shorten the distance between solving your current problems and solving problems that are much bigger. There's a lot to do with harping on established problems and research. And the other one is collaboration. Document everything. Contribute in ways that make your contributions usable by other people. Make your components usable in more than one place as much as you possibly can. Things like that. So this is kind of where design ops comes in, because if I were to answer the question, what is a design system? I would say a design system is a formula for acting on your established values and principles. So what that means is, I don't know, maybe you could call it a set of routines. I think that no matter what, you have to be open to the challenges of whatever individual project you're working on. But I think that once you have your values in place, they can't just be sort of lip service. You have to act on them. So the best way to do that is either in your work or in the way that you interact with your colleagues. So this could be something as granular as design itself. Do we have a Figma asset library? Do we copy and paste from a file? How design teams collaborate internally? Are we commenting? Are we having meetings? How we farm approval and iteration? How we work with engineers? How we document things? How we iterate on our design system? How we make decisions within it? I don't know, the component decision-making trees. And then, of course, informing the rest of your team about what's going on in the system. This may sound suspiciously familiar, and that's because a lot of the processes you're going to have to do in your design system ultimately map out to processes that you do as a UX designer, right? Um, Gathering feedback, gathering input, creating solutions, iterating, documenting, communicating, testing, so forth and so on. I could simplify this into five prime directives or I could simplify that sort of like diverse list of processes into five prime directives, which is, of course, making your dang designs, getting people aligned, getting your work out the door, resolving conflicts and issues, and improving understanding across the team. Ultimately, when you make processes, you already have these values, which are really sort of floaty, abstract, up in space. But when you put processes in place, what I mean to tell you is you want to aim for things that are concrete, things with steps, things with touch points, places where you're going to communicate with people, so forth and so on. So this could look like, I don't know, your double diamond. You could say, when we come up with a solution, we use double diamond as an organization, and we have our own steps within that. Which, for those unfamiliar, is a way of finding solutions to defined problems, researching, synthesizing the research, divide and conquer on actual solutions, and then putting it out into the world. That's one way to do it. The processes I tend to like are a bit more granular. So this is an example from Atomic Design of an excerpt of an incredibly long flowchart for deciding whether or not a component should be added to a design system, if it's a one-off, how you handle that, how it gets tested, who the individual stakeholders are. It could be something like that, but it also doesn't even have to be that crazy. It could be something like a meeting schedule. I know this picture stressed me out too when I saw it, but I don't know the best way I could express it. And meeting cadences are important. How frequently are you going to talk about design systems? Who are you going to talk about them with? Do you need meetings to get approval? Can you just send, Slack auto updates? Things like that. It could look like this. One thing that is really important, and this will come up later, is that your values and your processes, well, I've already kind of said this, that your values and processes necessarily intersect. So there have to be sort of touch points, like we saw in this sort of image in the initial slide for what's a design system, where you step back and consider, okay, does what I just put together in principle, the Motion app, does it actually fulfill all the values of our design system, which is like our baseline for quality? So it could be any number of things. That's an intentionally vague answer. There's also there's sort of a thin line between, design ops conversations and project management conversations. But I think for your design system, getting these five things out of the way is ultimately a good place to start. If you have a solution where or if you have solutions for all five of these prime directives, then you should be all right. So the biggest way I think I see processes enacted is through design tooling, which partly refers to Figma at a base level, but there's a lot that goes between designers and developers, a lot of different steps for getting what you've made onto the internet. The big thing I always say is that you should decide your tooling around your team's processes, not the other way around. So whenever I've built systems in the past, this is a rough list of what I've thought of. There's actually making the design, there's getting feedback, back to the component library part of this talk, where there's always a thing in play, whether it's Figma Teams or Design System Manager or whatever, to actually get your sort of nebulous components into a design. If you're using design tokens, where you put like tools where you would use as a repository for tokens, or ways to get stuff from Figma into that repository. documentation tools, my favorite, developer collaboration, how do you get your tokens and designs into developers' hands, ways to track issues, ways to track projects, and again, communication. So a lot of times, what I've found is when people put design systems together, what they'll do is they'll be like, okay, I know that these tools work the best for me, but sometimes that, a designer, developer, vice versa, may be handing off in a way that's ineffective. So what I think is important is to find tools that work either with what's already proven to work or what all parties involved are saying will work. So, oh yeah, I almost forgot to mention. You'll notice you'll notice this list might look a little bit familiar to the processes and prime directives that I meant before, or that I mentioned before. I think it's really important that if you pick your tooling, it has a specific purpose for what processes you're making or different parts of your process. If you have one tool that can handle multiple parts of that process, that's great. But again, tools as an expression of process, not building your entire process around, oh, I like Framer, or oh, I prefer to use Principle over ProtoPie, or I like Storybook because I've used it before. So here's an example of kind of a workflow of how to get a nice design to development pipeline of a design system. The thing about tooling is it gets very hairy because right now this workflow has Figma using the design tokens plugin to hand off into Style Dictionary, which developers will use as tokens for React, Kotlin for Android, and Swift for mobile. And then, of course, you have the components themselves that you'll hand off using Zeppelin. All of this ends up going into GitHub and then getting pushed to production. But wait, you also prototype too. So you have ProtoPie in your flow. It takes your component library from Figma and then passes off CSS and animation values otherwise for developers to sort of take down. And then you, of course, have to document every single thing. This seems kind of crazy, but every single step here is gated by a check to make sure that what you're putting out works with your processes and values. And let's not forget communication. Whenever you make one of these changes, whenever you go down one of these pipelines, your team's got to know. So maybe you have a newsletter or a Slack update, a Slack bot. Maybe you have a meeting. Maybe, I don't know, you get that little notification in the bottom right of your Figma that says assets updated. Whatever the case may be, all of this is gated in by values and principles. It's checked at every step. It's part of a process. Your tools are less of I use this because I like it, more because it fits into this step in the process. Everything is gated by values. Process is defined by values, so forth and so on. Everything is sort of hugging. That was a lot of information. So I've provided some brain floss for you in the form of 2 cats, a cozy blanket, and a really well organized set of buttons. I've also been talking a lot, so I am going to take this moment to see if there are any questions. No. Cat names are Pelusa and Poroto, which respectively are Spanish for lint ball and cranberry bean. They are, I think, 3 years old. They're in the exact same pose as they are in the picture next to me right now, but I can't show you because I'm in the presentation. Okay, here's our mental floss. Let's talk about design ops again. So I've sort of hinted a few times that the process for design system upkeep and design system building is very much like UX. One thing that I didn't really mention too much, in addition to setting up your design stack, as it were, matching it with processes, having everything influence each other, mapping back to core values, is iteration, right? The problems you're trying to solve if the problems you're trying to solve are expressed by your design system values and principles, the processes and tooling are how you solve that problem. Where does iteration, research, and feedback come in? So this is, I think, one of the least talked about aspects of a design system, but I know that, for one example, it was key to Atlassian building the incredible design system that they have today. Because when they started, it was a component library, and the way that they ended up being able to like build it out to their massive suite of products is through internal usability testing and internal research. Because remember, right, our design system is a product that's also a service to other designers. So we want to make sure that, and developers, of course, and PM. So of course, you have to check in to make sure that what you're doing is actually serving them. So look back at the prime directives, right? Getting your stuff out the door, aligning people, getting work out the door, resolving conflicts and production issues, and improving understanding of the design system. So I'm not. I could go like medium in depth. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I would encourage you to be creative and sort of come up with whatever you have, however you have it. But for the most important one, which is making sure your design system improves the designers, there's a few time to task ways or a few time to task tests that you can do regarding speed of how someone gets through a design challenge or find styles and assets. Surveying and interviewing seems like a low hanging fruit, but just asking people how they like the system, if it's working for them, maybe quantify it using a Likert scale, the worst metric in the world, NPS, something to that effect, on sort of specific qualities, not like how would you rate it 1 to 10, but how easily are you able to find the assets you need? How from a scale of 1 to 10, how much is this speeding up your process? Are you able to focus more on solving problems as a 0 or um, doing production work as a 10, something like that? And one thing that's pretty cool that, again, I know is part of Atlassian's process was just lurking, which sounds kind of uncomfortable. It's not as bad as it seems, but just like asking designers if you're able to be in the office or via Zoom, if you could just say, hey, can you share your screen? Can I see how you work? And that way, you could be silent, or you could just, the way you probably should do is, establish some kind of rapport with the designer you're talking to, and just kind of see what they do. And I mean, as a relatively young designer, I just find it useful anyway, but it's also a good way to find, pain points, bottlenecks in how people are designing. And it allows you to think of, okay, like what process and tooling adjustments can I make to uh, make that a little easier. Developers, you can test in the exact same way as designers. Um, Surveys and interviews, time to task with completing a coding challenge, either with or without a system if you're just trying to get buy-in for the system, or old or new iterations of a system to check improvement. And these time to tasks, by the way, like when you have to justify a business case, it's ultimately going to be like, okay, um, designers move 30% faster through this task, and you can sort of math out, okay, so if we have a 30% improvement, um, you can multiply that by however many, there's ways to math it out into how many hours you save per week per designer or per team. Same goes for developers. Um, Lurking devs, if you're a designer, may be difficult, but you can sort of like make it conversational if the developer's into it. Um, Surveys, as always. Shipping is where it gets interesting, though. In addition to individual work session metrics, you can also go into a lot of project management software. Jira is probably, unfortunately, the best way to do this. Um, is measuring like times from task assignment to completion, and seeing how that decreases, I guess, depending on context, the time that it takes to get something done. Um, you can check how many deadlines you missed versus how many you were given. You can ask. This is sort of a subjective thing, and I think this is something that a PM would probably be more likely to do, but something to the effect of like, okay, so we gave this grand vision for this product that we wanted to put out. How close did we come? There's ways to sort of customize metrics for that. How close did we come each time? How many times did we meet the vision? How close do we generally get? I can't speak for the wizardry that goes into that, but given a few hours and several notebooks, I could probably get through it. Um, Communicating your old friend surveys um, is a big one, because one aspect of design systems that's important for adoption by your team is letting people know what's there, having working sessions, letting people into, if you have a design team or a design systems team, or if you have design systems meetings, leave the door open. Send Slack updates and emails whenever something's new. Walk people through it, do workshops, make a point of talking about it when you're presenting actual designs. After you do a fair amount of communication, I think it's totally reasonable to send out a survey or a questionnaire about, like, hey, how comfortable do you feel with this? Do you know about this part of the design system? How have you been working with this? And seeing if the way you're communicating is effective. Um, there's also ways or times when tech leads can look through designs and codes, or designs and code, not codes, um, to see, okay, how many times has the design system been totally ignored? What percent of the things in production are in the system and haven't been established as like snowflake one-offs, or whatever the case may be? Like, are people just ignoring this because they don't know how to use it? Um, are there particular individuals or teams that we can work with and maybe get info on bottlenecks and pain points? And the last one's effectiveness. You can test for bugs, you can test accessibility, um, by checking how many bugs per release, perhaps, things like that, and tracking how much that number changes over time as the design system is iterated on. Um, Checking the number of one-offs in your product. Looking around to see how many times you notice things just kind of look or feel weird. That's totally subjective, but you can have a new feature built and it looks a little bit different in theme from the rest of your site. Interactions are slightly different, results are slightly different. That could just be a good indicator that you need to look a little deeper into how uniform things actually are. um, and I mean, getting all this research is a lot of time and effort. And I mean, who really gives a crap, right? Everybody. When you're working on a design system, you're not just building it for yourself, you're building it for your team, like I've said a bunch of times. And a lot of these metrics and a lot of these subjective areas of feedback become important for everyone you work with directly, right? For if you don't have a way to prove that you're, or if you don't have evidence that your design system is making life easier for everyone, then why are you doing it? You don't want it to be a headache. It's supposed to be a simplification method. Mm. For developers, you need feedback on whether what you're doing on the design end is actually supporting them. Um, if you're creating a bottleneck, if you're creating a headache and you don't know it, that's a good way to diminish relationships between designers and developers. And for PMs, that's where you start getting into like your company's budget, scheduling. And design systems are a pretty big upfront effort, and they're plus one product to however many you have. Um, and if it doesn't seem worth the effort, if it's not, making people work faster, create better solutions, um, then why sink cost and time and money into making this thing? You do have to justify it if you're in an organization whose income relies on whatever you put into your website or app, and you want to make sure that you're providing that value so that your organization can move a certain way. And the upside is, I at least in my experience, having a design system doesn't mean you get pushed harder by anyone higher up, but it could mean that you may have more bandwidth by having to focus a little bit less on like the minutiae of production design. If you can prove that, you can make a real impact in your comfort at work. I'm going to take a quick breather here to see if anyone's asking questions. No. Is everyone okay? Like, am I moving too fast? Is there anything that anyone wants some clarity on, or anything like that? or most of the way through. So I know I've given a lot of information, so I want to make sure that everyone is with me. Looks like we have one question on the way. Oh, thanks. All right, I'm going to keep going then. I know this is kind of uh, a nebulous set of things. In my humble opinion, so yeah, this much does go into design systems. I wanted to make a point at the beginning that it's not just a component library, because that's the deliverable. But you have the UI elements, and what do the UI elements do? That's what design systems hope to answer, and also the question of why are you collecting them and what justifies all this work. Um, but in my opinion, the piece de resistance of design systems is documentation. Documentation is a function of design ops, in my opinion, um, because it's literally just recording what your processes are, what your stack is, what your components and UI kit are, and what your values and principles are, so that everyone has access to them and everyone can make use of it. Um, but I wanted to make this its entire own section, uh, to drive a point home that documentation is probably the most important thing in the design system. You have documentation but not a Figma file, you can recreate the assets. If you have documentation and code samples but not code, you can pull from it. If you have a poorly put together tech stack but it's documented really well, people can use it. Um, so I would say whatever you do, document it. Make some note of it. Track your decisions, document updates in your versions so you can send them out to your team. Whatever you do, make sure it's in two places. When most people think of documentation, they think of components. Um, and I think this is a pretty good uh, primer for what to do per component. Because the other thing about documentation is it's effort, but you don't want to like totally destroy yourself over documentation. Um, but at basic, you should be saying what it is, where it goes, and why, and how to use it. Um, so that could be okay. A drop down, you put it in forms. You don't put it on landing pages because it looks weird when you do that, but put it in forms for this type of information because we've found that people react to it in a way that we like and increases conversions. Having examples is really nice. You can see what it. Most people just have the component on its own, but putting it in context is really helpful. Variations, props, knobs, and content areas. This is more frequently for developers, but sometimes there's information that developers have that designers don't, and this could be a good way to align. If you have a profile card component, designers might not know that it's pretty easy to change the color of the online now dot, and that may be discovered here. You shouldn't get to the point where you don't know you can change that color, but it's a way to know what can be varied. It's a good way to know how to stress test your components for, okay, here are the content zones. How much text can we put in here before it breaks? It's a good way to test for accessibility, things like that. And noting accessibility considerations, for example, if you're documenting a color, documenting what colors in your system it can and can't go on top of is really helpful. Knowing that, hey, this component's really useful, but you can't put it after, God, I can only really think of ridiculous examples. If you have like a radio button, it's like, hey, this is really useful, but you can't put it after drop down because of an exception in Y aria, and it gets tabbed to in a different order than one would expect. So try to avoid putting it after drop downs or after toggle tokens, something like that. That's always really important to have because I know one prime ROI of design systems is accessibility. And, the idea is that you want reliable components to be reliably accessible so you can kind of mash them together. Good to know where you can and can't mash them together. What I would love to see more from the design systems community, though, is documenting things that aren't just components. Documenting your tech stack, documenting your processes if you can. If you're doing internal documentation, who to talk to about certain aspects of your design system is really important knowledge, especially in bigger companies. I know that Google has north of 1,000 designers who work on some variation of material. The head honcho is one person, and they probably get thousands and thousands of emails a week that they don't need to be getting. Knowing who to talk to can be really useful. Also for new designers and developers too. Knowing what to do when something goes wrong, knowing or writing out known issues and plan fixes is good. How to not implement a process. I'm thinking here too also of like, maybe this is overstepping the topic of design systems, but I'd consider your company's tech stack part of the design system in a way, because everything leads up to it. Knowing how to work, I don't know, like custom frameworks or custom tools, having that really well documented can save people a ton of headaches. In case something goes wrong, you want to know exactly how to fix it, where to look for it, without having to reach out to, I don't know, I've heard the term overlord used before for, people who sort of corral all the information there. Document everything. It doesn't matter how stupid it is. We'll find a place for it. In general, best practices, design system documentation is technical-ish to technical. Be as specific as humanly possible about everything. Don't leave a thing out. Which kind of is a slippery slope, because you don't want to get so pedantic and information heavy that like the important stuff gets lost in the sauce. You want to write in a way that the person reading it will understand, but also with a great deal of specificity. The more the better. Just, use discretion. Okay. We're almost done. Yammered for about 45 minutes. I want to give you a couple of key takeaways for each section of this, because I know this is kind of like a nebulous idea. If I were to say, in this essay I will show you all the things that really define a design system more than its components and deliverables. If you had to define design systems after this, I would say it's a formula for acting on your team's established values and principles. A design system is a factor of design ops, which is how designers operate more than what they put out, or how you get designers to putting out what they put out, essentially. And it's a service to your entire organization. There are teams in my company that have used our design system that have nothing to do with the product design team, nothing to do with the engineering team, but they've used it for making presentations, communicating ideas. It's pretty cool. I would love for you to take away the idea that tooling and processes are inextricably linked to each other, and they should derive from the values and principles of your design system. I would stress the importance of getting feedback. I listed a lot of tests before, but just having some way to check in on how the design system's working. Even if in your retros post every sprint, you threw in a question like, how did the design system help you, and how did it hold you back? What should we know about it? How can we remove blockers? What would you like to see us do with it? That's pretty important. Document everything as best you can. Always be communicating. Make sure every single person on your team is fluent in your design system, and find out what's holding them back from being fluent. Fix it. Communicate the fix. Send weekly updates. Get people involved. One thing I should probably express about the communication too is it avoids exclusion. People don't like being kept in the dark for something that's an essential tool they're going to be using every day. Talk about design systems with everyone. I'm super annoying. I think I have some people from my company in this talk right now. They will totally mirror that I am the most annoying person about the design system in the entire company. um, One thing I can show you, removed it from our initial presentation because it got super long. But if you are interested in Figma nerdery, which I can get into after the talk itself, auto layout and variants are really good ways to make designing easier for you and easier to hand off to devs. Um, all components now have documentation links and descriptions, so you can put like 101 information for usage in Figma and link out if you need more information, which is super cool. Um, that's not so important. Don't worry about that as much, but these first four are what I would say keys to success in creating a design system and good ways to understand it. Um, I am going to, now that I have finished my lecture, open the floor to any questions that people might have. So the idea behind design systems, like I said, is that they're, if you're talking about making a design system from the start, the answer is everybody. And for maintaining it, the answer is also everybody. It's kind of a matter of who takes the initiative, and I find that usually it's a designer, frequently out of need for design QA or finding that production time is taking too long. Um, I there's a couple different ways it gets put into place. Sometimes the whole team contributes from the get go, which is my case, and that's super helpful because when people build the system, they know it best. But some organizations, specifically larger organizations, might have a dedicated design system team, um, and their primary job is to maintain and build the system. Um, there are questions too about, like, I know this is also, it's a very spacey answer, but it's a complicated question. Um, there are some organizations who start with a design system, put together styles, and then just apply it elsewhere and retrofit. And some organizations where the design comes first, you get a few different features out there, the design system absorbs the components, and then you sort of retrofit and make new designs with those components. And in that case, whoever made the components made the system. Um, as far as who should work on it, it really kind of depends. I am really for PMs getting involved in design systems. They don't always, because you have to make kind of strong business cases, which doesn't really say anything about the PM, but sometimes they'll be under pressure and the cost of a design system doesn't seem to have a big return on investment. Um, but having a PM gun for you and who really like knows the value, I think is important, and I like to see them there because having that structure to a design system team really makes a massive difference. As for designers, I was having this conversation last night with other people in UX House, and I think that for junior designers to get involved, it's sort of like anywhere else in the organization. We're keeping abreast of the component library, finding consistency stuff, um, adjusting components, getting used to talking with devs is cool. But I think that having a slightly more senior eye at the same time is useful because if a design system is really meant to assist you in the craft of designing, being extra familiar and having a lot of experience with that craft makes you a really good candidate to know how to improve the process. A lot of design systems, because they're not really uniform, they're all built slightly differently to fit the needs of each team. Um, they, God, I lost my train of thought. Um, Design systems are different for each team, and a lot of times it's a collection of things that are like, God, I wish I had this sooner. That's what I was going to say. And that tends to be knowledge that you gain from having done a lot of design. But that's not to say that, like, if you're a really visionary junior designer, that you can't get into this stuff. Um, I don't even really need to know a ton about code. You don't need to know a lot about organizational stuff, though it does help. But I find that you know I find that having just like a broad skill set does help when dealing with design systems. What other questions do y'all have? If there's support for the design system from a designer's team, but basically only will actually be doing all the work, what's some advice would you give? Only they will be doing all the work. What's some advice you would give? Hmm. So it sounds like, or I guess I need a little bit more information. So are there developers working on the design system in this case, or is it only really going to be a tool for designers in this designer's instance? So only only the designer would be using the system. It does show on a kind of a tough spot. The designer would be the only one working on it. And okay, it would be for dev too. Does said designer uh, want more support from other people, and do they know in what ways they would like other people to support? I'm intentionally keeping this anonymous because the reason I ask is because I've also been in situations where I'm the sole designer on a system, um, and on I actually think it's kind of nice in some ways because you have a lot of control. Um, okay, more support could be good, but it's unlikely to actually get it. The advice I would give, imagine it was requested, but it wasn't fulfilled. This is a very specific situation. I would say start small. Don't try and boil the ocean. Don't bite off more than you're comfortable chewing. Um, get really good at setting expectations. Um, you might have to do some evangelizing to get support. You may have to uh, you may have to do like the try me method where you know the design where something gets worked on, something else suffers because of the design system. But it could also be an opportunity as an evangelist to get really acquainted with the people around you who would be using the design system. Um, sorry, so the design system would be for dev, but the devs aren't actually working on the design system. Is this designer also a developer? I'm like, I want to give a good answer. I just there's a lot of pieces that are missing, and that may be part of the problem. Um, I still stick with don't try and make a big huge thing. You know, do the essentials, document the essentials, prove that it helps, um, and give people and ask for small things first. That's what I would say, and focus a lot more on your communications within the org because I'm sure the work that's being put out is fine. Um, if it's a small organization, frequently people who do design systems are the only person working on it. Thank you. uh, and that sometimes is how it is, and people do a lot of juggling. But if you're in a large org, I know that farming for advocacy can be a little bit difficult. And that's why I say focus on communication, building relationships, and so forth. Um, ultimately, like the gift you give will be a way to communicate more easily. You know, um, that's what I would say for now. I would also be curious as to why people are not supporting this hypothetical designer. in a design system. I know a lot of times designers get overworked and again do a lot of juggling. Um, but if someone's juggling, it seems like a design system would probably help them. I wonder why they're reticent. But yeah, that's what I would say. Thanks. What typefaces I use for the presentation? Um, so the headers are a Mazius display, which I think is from Colectivo, and it's free. This is the hyper italic variant, and everything else is in multiple weights of IBM Plex Mono, which is my favorite font on earth. Well, if there aren't any questions, thanks. I appreciate you guys hanging out while I yammer about design systems, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.